Good afternoon. I am not Dean Alyssa Ayers of the Elliott School of International Affairs. I am of the Elliott School, but Dean Ayers loves to introduce these book launches, and unfortunately can't be here this afternoon, this evening, for the current book launch. But that's not entirely unhappy because I'd love to introduce this book, partly because I'm interested to hear what the book is about, what the various contributors have to say. When you put out something called the Handbook of Illiberalism, it sounds first a little bit I don't know, ominous, like it, but from what I can tell from just taking a quick look at it, no, this is not a how-to be a liberal. Maybe people could learn that, but a real exploration of something that really does need exploration. Liberalism, in however you mean it, in the institutional forms, ideological forms, economic forms, has never been hegemonic, but it sometimes is a little bit in intellectual discourse. And so to start from kind of the other end, to find out much more about illiberalism, and also to understand what liberalism is a concept with very, very hazy edges. So I assume illiberalism may be as well. We'll be hearing, I hope, an awful lot more about that. The editor of the book, Marlene Laruelle, is one of our own. She's here at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Elliott School. So I will hand it over to her in just a moment. She's joined by another one of GW's excuse me,
mates.
Inmates. Yes. Sam, we're very glad to have you here. And actually, I should also mention one of the contributors from the book, Julian, was here. There he is. Okay, modestly sitting in the back, is one of the contributors, but it's a very, very rich and diverse set of contributors. I shouldn't say anything more myself. I should turn things right over to Marlene, the editor of the book, to introduce it to.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thank you for being here today. And yeah, it's a handbook of the study of illiberalism, not a textbook on how to make it happen. And I will, in fact, launch the conversation by saying a few words about, in a sense, what, Nathan, you were mentioning about why did we write 1,000 pages of a new concept with 45 chapters. So I'm not the only responsible. We were 45 of us making that decision. We still have some colleagues and experts who are not convinced by the term illiberalism, right? Who see it as a kind of conceptual inflation and who think that, well, we already have populism, which has been also inflated in terms of its use. We have conservatism, we have authoritarianism, we have far right, we have post-truth. So do we really need a new concept? And what is illiberalism bringing to the table? And so what we try to do in the volume is to say, yeah, it makes sense to use that terms, of course. And what it is bringing to the table, well, it's bringing its name itself. Because when you say illiberalism, you immediately force the readers to look at liberalism and to think about liberalism, which has been, I think, the kind of, forgotten space through which we have been looking at populism, far right, post-truth, authoritarianism, and so on. So in fact, illiberalism, it's a kind of, crisis language for liberalism, or language for the crisis of liberalism. And that's what we have been trying to explore in the book. So when we look at all the illiberal electoral successes of 2024 in Europe, in India, in the US, I think what we have been seeing is not the end of liberalism, but the end of the hegemony of liberalism, the kind of clothing moment where its status as the kind of obvious normative social and political order is arriving. And so what we are entering now is probably an era where, well, no, it's not obvious to say that liberalism is the best political and social normative system. And to succeed, liberalism will have to make the demonstration with some evidence that it is the best system, or it would have to renew itself in the current form and kind of to renew itself and kind of reinvent itself. So what we try to do in this collective volume is to explore how the concept of illiberalism was helping us capturing something that is not only or not always populist, not only or not always conservative, not only or not always authoritarianism, not always fake news, but something that is about a kind of genuine discomfort by some of the world constituencies with the world as it is. And so what we do with the book is that first we conceive illiberalism as an ideology, not as a style or performance, which is what populism is doing, and not as a regime. So it's not about discussing the nature of regime. Usually the two bodies of literature have been either on regime aspect, authoritarianism, or on kind of style and performance and communication, and that's populism. We try to conceive ideology, illiberalism as an ideology, and I will come back on that. Then we also try to look at the grassroots demands, right? The majority of the literature is about, leaders. You think illiberalism, you think Trump, Meloni, Erdogan, Putin, Orban, you think names, right? What about thinking societies? What about thinking demands, grievances, what is making sense when you have a grassroots demand for illiberalism? What we also try to do, and I think the whole field, is that by using illiberalism, we are in a sense rehabilitating affective politics, right? It's about shame and pride, anger and despair. And when you use these notions, it means you have to move away from the classical kind of political science language, and also to involve sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, because there is a whole world of illiberal production that is the cultural one on things happening on the ground that is usually not captured in the studies we have so far. So where the volume, I think, is really pushing forward the field is that first it's looking at illiberalism not in a kind of black and white binary with liberalism. We have the bad illiberals and the good liberals. It's looking at the entanglement we have between both notion. It's showing that, well, there are moments where liberalism has been illiberal, things, foreign intervention, colonialism. We have moments where in a liberal democratic framework, you have public policy that are illiberal. Things counter-terrorism, things migration policy, things sometimes freedom of speech. You may have a left that would fit the definition of illiberalism while being still close to some of the philosophical values of liberalism. And then we have a coexistence and a competition between illiberalism as a political offer and liberalism in our own liberal democratic system. So what we are trying to do is not kind of authorizing illiberalism as something that always comes from abroad or from the bad guys, but are looking at something which is a byproduct of our own liberal societies. The second thing we are doing in the volume is that we are coming up with a definition of illiberalism that is tested by all the different chapters. People have different focuses, different disciplines, they work with different countries, and they are kind of testing the definition and see if it works for them or not. What is interesting in this concept of illiberalism is that this prefix ill, in Latin, it means both non-liberal, anti-liberal, a-liberal, and not fitted for liberalism. So you can interpret the ill as being more or less everything in relation to liberalism, right? So you have this kind of semantic ambiguity and fluidity that is part of the concept itself. And so what we have been doing, we try to look at three core elements of the definition. The first one is to see liberalism as what we call an ideological family or an ideological universe. It means it's context dependent. You don't have one recipe that works for all countries. It depends on the political culture, of the different grievances. It depends on the time. It depends if you are in the global north or in the global south. So you have multiple concrete illiberal products that can emerge. Second element, it's arrived after having experienced liberalism. So it's a kind of backlash. And we use that element to try to avoid naming illiberalism everything that is not liberal democracy, right? North Korea is not illiberal, right? You need to have been liberal and then to consider it failed for you and you move on something else. So in a sense, it's a post-liberal experience. And then the third element of the definition is that there is a content and a substance to illiberalism. And I think one of the problems has been that for very long, the literature has been kind of patronizing on the fact that if you are not liberal, it means you are in a counter project that has no content and no legitimacy. And I think we have arrived at a time where we have to realize that it's not the case. I mean, just listen to G.D. Vance, presidential debates. You may not like it, but there is a political project. There is a political project with philosophical overview of what the society should be, what the social order should be. And that's a political project as any offer. So the four elements we see in the definition, and you will see that we try to have it narrow enough to keep the concept making sense, and at the same time broad enough to try to encompass all the different context-dependent aspects. For illiberals, you want to rehabilitate the sovereignty of the nation state against multilateralism and against some forms of globalization. On the political level, you want a majoritarian system and you want to rehabilitate authority. Authority can be rehabilitated to make democracy more efficient. It can also be shifting toward authoritarianism, but I think it's important to dissociate authority from authoritarianism. You need to believe in a form of homogeneity for the nation. It can be a very ethnic, racial definition of the nation. It can be a much more assimilationist of the nation. Migrants are welcome, but they need to assimilate. Or it can be, we find with a diverse society, but the borders are closed now. So who is in, but who is out has to stay out. So here also, there is a portfolio of interpretation of this homogeneity of the nation. And fourth point, you need to believe in some form of traditional hierarchy and social order. It can be fighting against LGBT rights and against abortion, which is what has been the most probably visible. But it can also be more subtle element that just, the refusal of the idea that you have a white guilt, and this idea that, Western civilization don't have to apologize for who they are, for what they did in the world. And so it's a kind of guilt-free ideology on many aspects. And so that's not enough, of course, to explain all the different elements, that all the different concrete illiberal movement. They may be diverging a lot in their economic policy, in their foreign policy, on the way they are articulating conservative values, on the way they want to be conservative, and on the way they are rebellious and almost revolutionary. They want to destroy the system as it is. So there are a lot of kind of graduation possible inside this family of illiberalism. Then we look at this illiberalism in a broader context in which we see Enlightenment values being more and more questions. Individualism is questioned because we see societies that are asking for more common goods. So we know what we share and what we are living together, why we are living together. Universalism is getting questioned and is getting criticized probably because it's linked to globalization, and globalization is interpreted negatively. Rationality is in doubt here also because it got discredited by being associated with technocracy. And we have good studies that show that the decredibilization of science and medicine, for example, if we think COVID time, is very much connected to the decredibilization of kind of professional expertise and technocratic expertise. And then we see the notion of progress that is also getting put under question, with societies having a huge difficulties in imagining a kind of optimistic future. And so for very long, the majority of this illiberal political offer were playing on this notion of retro-utopia. So you project the past as your political project for the future. As I said, it's context dependent. And I think what we have seen in this country arriving these last few months is showing a new way of articulating a project where we had Trump classic kind of retrotopia, where we make America great again, and then associating it with this kind of technological utopia coming from Elon Musk. So you have suddenly something that is both looking toward the past, but also projecting a kind of almost science fiction dystopian future. And some of our colleagues name it reactionary accelerationisms, which I found was an interesting combination. And then last point in the volume, we look at the reasons, of course, for the rise of illiberalism. We look at the social economic grievances due to our neoliberal structures. We look at culture war and all the demographic fears. We look at how media ecosystems are destroying the common goods. And we look at the failure of the liberal international order in promoting more equality and fairness. So the volume is organized around 8 big kind of subsection, one on the concept with which illiberalism is dialoguing, so authoritarianism, populism, one on this entanglement between what is liberal, what is illiberal. Then we have 2 other sections that look at both the political economy of illiberalism and the kind of culture war aspect and how everything should be read through this kind of intersectionality of class and race, for example. Then we look at some case studies, country, because we want to take into consideration this context dependency. And we have a lot of great case studies coming from the global south, and not looking at the global south as a periphery, but as something that is core in the field in bringing knowledge on the notion of illiberalism. And we look at how illiberal countries or regimes are trying to reshape the world order. And then in the last two parts, we looked at the more grassroots demand, the cultural production, the intellectual world, the think tanks, and all this more kind of cultural and intellectual production of illiberalism. And I think at the end, the term is, of course, it has its own limits, and I'm happy to have them discussed, but I think it's a good term to try to capture the current crisis and to continue trying to identify what are systemic transformation of the societies in which we are living, and not only what is just the superficial aspect, which is usually where media tend to stop and not looking at the kind of really structural transformation of our societies. And I think the concept on that is really kind of refreshing the field on the general discussion we're having on all this transformation. I will stop here. Thank you very much. And then I will give the floor to Sam.
So I think I'm here this afternoon in my capacity as a skeptic about the concept of illiberalism, at least as an orienting concept for a body of study. So what I'm going to do is raise a series of questions that I think illustrate my doubts, and then Marlene can tell me why I am wrong. And they begin with an issue that Marlene already mentioned, which is the way that the term illiberalism centers liberalism. Liberalism is the core. The prefix ill means somehow un or non or against. So one of the challenges here is that it's a derivative definition. First, you need to define liberalism. Then you need to define whatever it is that makes something non-liberal or somehow unconnected with liberal. I think that gets into sort of conceptual gymnastics that are probably more complicated than you want to sustain. And for that reason, I'm more attracted to Julian Waller's definition, which you do mention as one of the better ones in the introduction, which emphasizes not just non-liberalism or disconnection from liberalism, but explicit opposition to liberalism. I think anti-liberalism is a much more useful concept than illiberalism. And descriptively, that also seems more accurate. You know, you think of what Viktor Orban was saying when he proclaimed his support for illiberal democracy. He didn't mean simply non-liberal democracy in the way that you could describe the democracy of ancient Greece as non-liberal. He meant a form of democracy that was based on different foundations and would be in practice different to what is conventionally understood as liberal democracy. So I think descriptively that makes sense. But even then, there's a risk of making liberalism normatively central and suggesting that anything that is not liberalism and even anti-liberal is somehow a deviation or degradation or wrong term. And this is exactly what illiberalism or anti-liberalism aims to challenge. The concept of illiberalism seems to assume the premise that's under discussion. One of the things that some of the figures and movements who are discussed here are saying is that liberalism is, at best, one option among many that are available. And part of their critique is the way that liberal thinkers, liberal movements, and liberal institutions try to foreclose any alternative. To dismiss it as illiberal is not merely to say that it's wrong, but that it is somehow impossible or incoherent. And to sort of illustrate this criticism, imagine that this is 30 or 40 years ago, and we are sitting at a Soviet university, and a Soviet university press has just brought out the Handbook of Anti-Marxism, which has studies of liberalism and social democracy and other non and sometimes anti-Marxist movements. I think everyone would immediately recognize that there is a normative claim here about the status of Marxism relative to these challenges. And I think, or I ask, whether illiberalism has the same drawback. So that's my first question. My second question is whether there really is a crisis of liberalism, which is driven largely, if not exclusively, and you emphasize this in your comments as well as the introduction, from the right. I'm just not convinced that this is true. And I think the argument that it is depends on a highly contentious and selective definition of liberalism. So in the introduction to the volume, Marlene quotes Stephen Holmes and other political scientists who claim that illiberalism is, quote, a set of social, political, cultural, legal, and mental phenomena associated with the waning of individual liberty, in a parenthesis, personal freedom, as an everyday experience. But arguably, right or conservative or populist or nationalist or illiberal movements are defending liberalism by that definition, or at least aspects of historical liberalism, by emphasizing concepts including free speech, equality before the law versus multicultural equity, bodily freedom, especially with regard to COVID restrictions, and associational freedom. And I think it's true that this particular response is more concentrated in the United States, or at least in the English-speaking world, but I don't think that it's limited to it. Now, you can say that the right is selective or instrumental in applying some of those concepts, but so surely is the left. And here, too, it seems to me that one source of ostensibly illiberal resistance is the way that the mantle of liberalism has been claimed by institutions and actors that use liberal rhetoric, but do not seem particularly committed to individual freedom as an everyday experience, particularly as an experience for normal as opposed to marginal populations. And of course, liberalism itself, by any standard definition, notoriously includes illiberal elements, especially in its tendency toward elitism and technocracy. Now, Marlene knows all of this and acknowledges much of it in the introduction, which I have read. I cannot say that I have read all 900 pages. I think I read about 130, and that was a lot. But there's much more to consider. And I don't want to review that in detail or dwell on sort of quibbles. I can't resist one quibble. At one point, it's suggested that a source of skepticism or resistance to liberalism has to do with the failure to respond to climate change and other ecological concerns. I would say it's only liberal regimes that have done anything whatsoever about ecological concerns. Non-liberal regimes have no positive track record of promoting the environment, but that's a minor issue. And on the whole, the introduction is a welcome effort to avoid this sort of essentializing and normalizing that I've complained about. But that effort has its own problem, which is that it just raises complexity. So after reading the introduction, I was still uncertain how to define and thus operationalize liberalism. And I understand that that's partly because you're dealing with a large number of contributions and they're all doing different things. But if we can't do that for liberalism, then it's even harder to do it for illiberalism, which, as I described, is an inherently derivative concept. Trying to take account of all of the controversies, and you have a list of 5 or 6 contestations, as you call it, is worthy and helpful, but perhaps ultimately self-defeating. It's not clear to me at the end what ground there is to stand on in applying this concept. So is there a family resemblance and internationally comparable cases? Yes, I'm sure that is true. But is there a coherent field of illiberalism studies? There, I am less convinced, and perhaps I would feel differently after reading the whole 900 pages rather than the 130 or so pages that I sampled. But my impression, or at least concern, is that this really is a case of people using similar words to describe different things, and that in shedding light on these phenomena, which are real and important, division rather than synthesis would be more helpful.
Yeah. So I take 2 minutes, right, to launch the discussion, and then we will open that to the floor to your question. Yeah, thanks, Sam, for all these comments. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of this discussion as a group because we met very regularly on Zoom while preparing the books. And so there was a lot of discussion about the kind of heuristic value of the term. And a lot of the colleagues who participate were not necessarily like at ease with it, or it was not their kind of their obvious terminological choice. But I think there was, for all of them, there was this idea that if you just use, populism, far-right conservatism, authoritarianism, you are still missing some things that is trying to make sense of the role of liberalism being kind of weakened, challenged, question now. And that was the kind of a way to enter the topic, moving away from the kind of, the classic vision and every concept has its own limitation. Populism has a ton of them. Authoritarianism, also far right, has one because it's situational. It means that you have a right that is non-far. And so every concept has its own limitation. But I think the way we are trying to address it was always, indeed, it's a kind of ex negativo by principle, right, concept, because it's based on the liberalism. But we were trying each time to really, depending on the context, the time, the angle of the chapter, to try to define what is seen as liberalism in this definition, which kind of script is that about political liberalism, economic, cultural, geopolitical, and so on. And I think several of the articles were also about, well, maybe it's all situational, right? It's about actors themselves would define the other side is the liberal, I'm the liberal. So it's a boundary construction moment by each actor in each different context. So I think we were all trying to kind of deal with this issue of the centrality, the normative centrality of liberalism, which at the same time, when you look in what the research has been, the field has been producing, very often liberalism is the implicit element of the majority of the political science field when they are discussing far-right conservatism or authoritarianism, right? So there is also a kind of lack of self-criticism from the field in considering that liberalism is the obvious answer. I think we try to have the kind of the both questioning challenges to liberalism that comes from the left, and having both some author who identified as being part of the leftist literature, some, and therefore themselves critical of this liberalism, illiberalism dichotomy, people trying to question the possibility of a leftist illiberalism. So I think we are trying to indeed play with all this concept. And I think something where we were more or less coming in agreement in the process of writing the volume was that indeed illiberal figures are claiming liberalism very often, a kind of old-fashioned or authentic liberalism against what they see now as the kind of failed or excessive or postmodern liberalism, or saying themselves, we are the liberals and the others are the illiberals. So I think we were trying to look at all this notion and accept the fact that the concept is both an academic concept that we try to construct with all the limitation of the field and the fact that we want to categorize things, and the fact that it's used by the actor themselves in a huge kind of fluidity. And so you can be the liberal of an illiberal and the illiberal of a liberal in almost kind of every context, right? So how do we as scholars try to make sense academically of a concept that is so much fluid and present in the society? I think that was one of the challenges that we were trying to kind of grasp.
Well, let me pose the question, maybe in a more geographical way, as opposed to a conceptual one. Would it be wrong to think that the core cases here are really Eastern and Central Europe? Which is to say, societies that were believed to have made a so-called liberal transition. This, of course, is a problematic term in political science, because transition suggests that it goes, the arrow goes only one way. That turned out not to be true. There are institutions and actors in those societies who identify as liberal in some degree, as well as those that oppose them. And there you can really see liberalism as the center of the contest. But as you move away from more or less Eastern and Central Europe, that picture becomes less clear. As you go to the West broadly, the debate looks more like a family argument within liberalism. I think that's true particularly in the United States, but to some extent also in Britain and even in France. And as you go to the East, it's no longer really about liberalism quite so much. It looks more like non-liberalism than a fight about liberalism as the central ideological category, which is not to say that there isn't geographic and conceptual stretch with any term. But do you think that in drawing the map here, what the book is doing is sort of focusing us on Hungary, on Poland, on other post-Warsaw Pact, if not post-Soviet states, and turning away from Western Europe and the Atlantic world and Asia on the other?
So I don't think so. I think the majority of the literature historically, if I may say, like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, was indeed largely coming from Central Europe. That's where the concept was. But at that time, the concept was very much associated with regime, right? It was a way to talk about the regimes. I think now the literature has really moved away from the centrality of Central Eastern Europe or Latin America, which is probably the other kind of big region where it was very much discussed. And I think in the volume, we have a lot of cases that would be Western Europe centric and really trying to move that away from the Central European laboratory that was indeed the reality maybe historically. So I think I see what you mean, but no, I think that, and maybe indeed in the kind of Anglo-Saxon context, it's the fluidity is really more problematic. In continental Western Europe, I think in France, you would have a genuine debate about, this kind of non-liberal or anti-liberal kind of formulation. And when you move to the global south, where I think you have the transformation, it's that it's become much more geopolitical and much more about kind of colonial experience and kind of Western domination. And that's the way to read liberalism for the majority of the kind of global south. But look at what is happening in India. Look at Philippines. I mean, there are a lot of cases that are kind of global south, where it's very much about, nation state homogeneity, traditional values, and so all the core element that we were trying to have in the definition. So I would say that I think we really did the effort to move away from the Central European cases, which I think is problematic because it's the one that created the binary, right? You have the Orban and a Polish case and Putin's Russia, who are unable to make their transition, and then you have the liberal democratic West. So I think now the volume is really much more, in fact, centered about illiberalism is a byproduct in our own society of whatever is called liberalism now. Yeah, I think we open the floor for questions. There will be mic coming for you to talk, so people who are online. Yes, so Anatole here, and then we'll go back. Here, you pass.
Yes. Is it on?
Yeah.
Full disclosure, I'm a contributor.
Yes.
But of course, one point is when it comes to the use of language, the way that liberalism is used in America, which is profoundly misleading from a historical point of view. People like Bernie Sanders are described as liberal or ultra-liberal when they are in fact, of course, socialists. Robert Reich is a social democrat. But this leads back, I think, to the relationship between liberalism and economics or economic policy, and which has perhaps contributed to the confusion, because Thatcher called herself a conservative, but of course in her economic policy, and indeed to some extent in her wider policies, and certainly in her willingness to enforce her economic policy through authoritarian means, she was absolutely, classically 19th century liberal. And not in certain respects conservative at all in a historical context, remembering that the 19th century liberals were also nationalists, very largely. And perhaps from the economic point of view, one way of looking at this is that in stages between the early 20th century and after the Second World War, most of liberalism, but only in very slow stages, was willing to compromise with social democracy, under the shock of communist revolution, which of course initially drove many liberals, especially in Italy, into fascism. But after the Second World War, for 30 odd years, there was this liberal social democratic consensus. And in some ways, everybody became a liberal, because the Social Democrats equally abandoned their more radical socialism. But then from the 1970s, of course, you could say that even, Blair and Clinton, a large part of the Social Democrats, if you will, actually became 19th century liberals to a degree. And now we have a situation of total confusion, in which, partly, of course, especially in Britain and America, where the first past the post system holds together in one party people from totally different historical traditions, which makes it very difficult, I think, to talk coherently now about what liberalism and therefore illiberalism is. I say that having tried to contribute. But is Bernie Sanders a liberal on cultural grounds? Is he an illiberal on economic grounds? Is he? What is he exactly? Maybe he should. Maybe the term liberal is simply irrelevant here. And where on earth do the old mainstream Republicans stand, who are, of course, also much more like 19th century liberals than what they call liberals today? Maybe just some disconnected remarks.
No, I think it's a great point on how much the economic interpretation of liberalism, right, has been really. It's probably the moment where in the analysis, it's the most difficult to articulate, illiberalism. And there are people continuing working on this idea that, an illiberal government is still liberal economically, right? And neoliberal on many aspects, yet it's kind of shifting some of the redistribution mechanism to a specific ethnic or identified core group of the nation. So people who try to kind of bring more nuances on the way we interpret economic policy and on the kind of evolution. Of course, I think time is a big issue. And so in the book, we really try to focus on the last 50 years, right? And so we have two kind of birth dates. One is the 60s with the kind of cultural revolution in the West, and then the early 80s with the neoliberal revolution being the kind of two birth moment of the time frame we use for illiberalism. But what you are mentioning about the confusion, there was even this colleague saying we are in its confusionisms now, which I think is problematic because it supposes that you have clear definition and then they got mixed. But maybe the definition don't exist anymore, right? They are just irrelevant now, as you were mentioning. And so I think a great example of that in Germany is, of course, Sarah Wagner-Knecht, because it's this kind of leftist economically, but anti-migration and pretty conservative in terms of value. So it's, you can see the political offer is getting re-articulated in a totally different way of the liberally liberal or the right left as we have it usually in Europe.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist. I tell this to students, but they don't believe me.
Let's collect several questions. So Julian, and then we come here, and then we will take several in a row.
This is on?
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, it's funny. I also a contributor to the handbook. I remember when I told my father I was writing a chapter on illiberalism, he's like, "Oh, what an ugly word. That must be bad things. It's just an ugly, clunky word." But I think one aspect of the conceptual discussion and also just the terminological discussion is scholarship has a bad tendency, or academia has a bad tendency when it wants to describe something it doesn't like. If it doesn't have something in the toolkit, it will use something else that's perhaps worse or even less applicable. So in the last 10 years, we've heard a lot about populism, but suddenly populism meant everything. And it just meant everyone we didn't like. And then authoritarianism is the same thing. Anyone we didn't like, it's authoritarian, moving away from something rigorous, something we can test, something we can measure. And I think we've seen in the last year a new tendency, the last several years, of the new word that everyone is using all the time is, of course, the F word. It's all fascism, right? So Putin is a fascist, Modi is a fascist, Donald Trump is a fascist, Hungary is a fascist state, all the far right in France are fascists. Anyone who's not on the good side is a fascist. And as we know, that's terminologically unacceptable if we want to use that term to describe something specific. We just want to be Stalinists and say even the Social Democrats are fascists, that's fine, right? That's the old play if we're members of the Comintern. But if we're not, we have to use something else to describe it. And I think there's a utility in this clunky term, which describes a more varied phenomenon, does not have the normative resonance as something of utility. And I think we're seeing this today and then sort of extreme hyperbole and also just sort of collapsing of categories. So it might be the case that we should use more nuanced, set defined terms. Maybe we really need, we're talking about Russian illiberalism, we should have a name for that. If we're talking about American illiberalism or Anglo-American illiberalism, we need to have a name for that too. And we need to have names for this and for that and the other thing. But if scholarship doesn't have the capability to maintain itself in a rigorous way, having a fuzzier concept that avoids some of the biggest pitfalls is probably of utility.
Let's move here. So many questions.
I look at this as a anti-word, negating something, reacting to something like antimatter. And how far it goes in negating and resisting is yet to be seen in this country and elsewhere. But if you think about the liberal values that people are reacting to, and again, this is American-centric, that's basically where we live. People looked at political correctness, microaggressions, civil rights carried to an extreme, and it almost comes down to the value of whites being displaced, whether they're in Eastern Europe or Central Europe or whatever, foreigners displacing, and the notion that you should make room for them because that would be a liberal value.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi. Well, congratulations on the publication. And I have actually a question following up from before. So what is the utility of this new term and what does it help us better understand about, for example, Russia attacking Ukraine for no reason or other wars or like other big events? And what better, like, in what way is this new concept helping us better understand the current conflicts and wars than other concepts like authoritarianism or liberalism, actually, for that matter?
side.
Thank you and congratulations. This is suddenly extremely relevant after last Tuesday. I'd like to return to the comments of our British colleague. I may be simplifying this or being repetitive, but I believe that in the 19th century, this word liberal, which has associated with liberty, liberty for whom? I think maybe in the 19th century in England and continental Europe, this meant liberty of markets to find their own levels. I think maybe the Chicago School of Economics would fit into that. And in America, we tend to use the word in an opposite sense, liberty for the individual. And I think when Americans use this word, they're thinking progressive, but they're not saying it. And so I think our British colleague made a very important point that east and west of the ocean, we have opposite meanings for this word. I'm sure you debated this to death when you were writing the book. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is about nationalism. So I'm sympathetic with Sam's critique, and it's come up with some of the others. You know, what you've got is a term that's defined by what it's not, and that's going to be kind of hazy. But in some ways, you anticipated that in your remarks because you did give us some positive context. Some had respect for a hierarchy, authority. And one of them was homogeneity of the nation, which is, to me, interesting. And I just want to understand a little bit about where that comes from. If you define illiberalism as anti-liberal, if you were to have had an anti-liberal international in the 19th century, most of those showing up, signing up for membership, would probably have been more religious than nationalist in nature. And yet now, almost all the examples that have been cited of illiberals, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, are nationalists. So I'm just wondering, is this something that is historically contingent, just something that is recent? Is it a necessary part of your definition? I'm just interested in how it is that national homogeneity is associated with illiberalism in a way that I don't think it would have a century.
Wow. It's connecting the back and then you can.
So you seem to be using this term liberalism in a, I've read a few books on the history of liberalism. One of the common approaches is to analyze the history of it, how this word started, how it was used, how it evolved. Very contextual, it's very historical. As someone else alluded to earlier, it's fuzzy definitely. I think there's a lot of utility in that, especially when it's applied in the right place, especially in places where, what Wittgenstein would have referred to, where family resemblances are appropriate. When it's organic and it's historical, those seem to be the right places to use it. But then I think it's very easy to take this term and then to move it into another area where it's not very appropriate anymore. When you're talking about categories and when you're really talking about conceptual clarity. And in that area, I think it would be more appropriate to have a truly pure definition of what liberalism is. So I kind of have a two-part question for you. One, do you think without reading the book, have you made a category error of taking this organic term and generalizing it to the point where it's no longer historically and contextually appropriate? Or two, if you have explicitly rejected a non-fuzzy, a sort of purely conceptually oriented approach towards defining liberalism, why did you reject that approach?
Sorry, I wanted to get my question in because I can't stay for the whole event. So I have a question that's similar in many ways to what many people have been saying, which is about utility, because I'm of kind of two minds on this, which is that I think on the one hand, I think that the term does have clear utility in our present moment. What I'm interested in is kind of the long view and also the longevity of the term itself, which is because I think that if we problematize liberalism, many of the things that are outlined in your introduction and in general what we talk about when we talk about illiberalism are perfectly compatible with the historical record of liberalism, and I think can be perfectly compatible with a kind of broadly liberal society now. And I think that, my own view on this is that I think that liberalism has a set of of kind of core principles that in moments when its power or its hegemony is not in question, they can all operate sort of simultaneously and harmoniously. But the moment that that hegemony is questioned and these things actually face acute tensions, liberalism has to choose between, say, tolerance and maintaining order, which I think are both key elements of the liberal tradition. Sometimes those exist harmoniously and sometimes they don't. And liberalism is perfectly capable of being extremely repressive to maintain order and not maintain tolerance. So my question really is this, though, because I think now we're seeing a liberalism that is becoming, if we use this kind of, this definition that we know, now it's becoming illiberal, which then I think throws into question, on anything, on free speech. I think this is true. Tariffs now, like economic liberalism, I think is now the consensus on protectionism is becoming clearer and clearer. The point of this is that, like, in 10 years, if what we are thinking of now as liberalism has embraced all of these elements of what we're calling illiberalism, right? To what extent now will this term illiberalism mean anything, like, in a useful way? Do you see what I mean? So it's about the kind of longevity of this term. So, of course, terms can develop and evolve and all these sorts of things. But I just wanted to kind of problematize that specific issue and ask what you think of that.
I'm an economist, so so pardon me for my not being familiar with in a deep way as my colleagues are about the rhetoric. So, I was recently writing a paper on governance in democracies, and we were talking about sustainability and so on and so forth. And instead of calling them liberal democracies, because given that what everyone's pointed out about the nebulous nature of this word and how it's understood differently in different countries, we just call them capitalist democracies. Now, going towards, because we were dealing with economics, and so I go back to some of the questions that have been raised why isn't there a set of core characteristics, right? And this could be 5, 7, 10, whatever they are, and there'll be a combination of them, which we could say that some combination of this. Think of a Venn diagram, right? I've got a circle in the middle, I've got a universe, and I can say that anything inside this circle is liberal, and anything outside is not liberal, non-liberal, whatever you want to call it. The point I'm trying to get at is that when I came into this talk, my sense was that illiberalism would define liberalism and then give me some metric which says around this pure definition of liberalism, you can still be quote unquote liberal. But when you stretch yourself beyond this in a certain direction, you could be characterized as illiberal, right? But obviously, like I said, I don't understand the history of the term. The reason why I asked that is that in the paper that we wrote, we said that what we need to do for governance is to attain three balances: a balance between state and market, a balance between labor and capital, and a balance between nature and humanity, to talk about the environmental crisis and so forth. So not just do we have to define liberalism, but we in some sense have to define sustainable liberalism, because I could, in a static sense, define liberalism, but that may not last because of certain characteristics. So you see why I, as an economist, I'm confused. And I think some of the questions raised here are very important, that there should be some way, even if it's very complex, could be, here are 10 characteristics that make this guy, if you don't have an open media system, you're not going to be liberal for very long. So that brings in the thing that it's not just static, it's dynamic. I start with certain characteristics, this is not going to last. This is going to become bad in some way, you want to call it. Okay, so you see the dilemma. We who are not political science are dealing with this. So I don't know if that was a question or whether that was this.
No, a lot of great points. Thank you all so much, and happy to see that the field is creating, or the discussion is creating a lot of
Quantify
debates.
direction.
So there are so many questions. Very briefly on some of them, and then on the kind of the big one on the categorization of illiberal to understand the war, for example. That's not, for example, what I would be using, right? I don't think that's saying Russia is illiberal help us explaining the war, right? Because I think it's not the right angle to put. It's explaining what is the ideological construction of the Russian regime that doesn't explain the decision making that push a country to invade its neighbor. So I would be careful in kind of not projecting the terms. It's help understanding, I think, some of the tension we have on kind of the liberal world order getting challenged, but it doesn't explain kind of individual concrete policy. On the nationalism as being part of the definition, I think, so you have two processes there. Oh, he left. No, that's okay. I can still say it briefly. One is what we call the culturalization of citizenship. That is that increasingly we want to identify our citizenship not with political right, but with kind of a moral or something identity that we share. So it's about we need to share way of life in one way or another. And it's kind of pushing to this rehabilitation of the idea of a kind of national homogeneity, and also the fact that the nation state is interpreted at the last place against the last protection against a destabilizing globalization, and a place where you still have a definition of the common goods, which we don't have yet at the planetary level. So I think that explains the rehabilitation of the nation state. Then a lot of the other question were about the kind of conceptual fluidity or the problematic around the concept itself and its articulation with liberalism. And I think we try to deal with that when we try to study that, right? So depending on the discipline, we embrace that complexity. We embrace that liberalism itself is complex, that it has evolved over time, that what is liberal and what is illiberal now could be reversed or reinterpreted in different contexts and in time. I think we tried to deal with that. I think one of the tension indeed that we had as a collective was about, are we trying to come up with a definition, and then we see who enter the definition, and then we do an index, a database, a visualization of that kind of thing. So trying to categorize and label political experiences, or do we want to, on the contrary, just say we are studying how the term is spreading, and so whoever is using it, we are beginning from that, and we let people, actors themselves, defining the boundaries of who are they defining themselves liberal or illiberal, and how they are themselves creating that kind of relationship. And so I think it depends very much on which disciplines people are coming. I could see that, of course, if you come from political science, there was more a tendency of trying to say, let's come with a definition, and then we categorize and we see who is in, who is out. Those who were more kind of cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, was more about, let's just see how people are using this term, how this notion of illiberalism is spreading, and who are the actors, how do they define themselves? So not imposing a categorization, but letting the grassroots actor kind of making the binary themselves on different cases. So I think all that is still kind of very much fluid, and I don't think, and precisely because it's a handbook, it's not an edited volume or a collective monograph, right? So the idea was not to arrive to a kind of shared agreement. The idea was that we give a concept with a preliminary definition, and we ask everybody to apply that to their own discipline, their own country, their own angle, and see if the term makes sense or doesn't make sense for them. And so for some chapter, some scholars were like, well, okay, it makes a little bit sense, but I would still prefer not to use it because the other concepts are maybe more relevant, or it's displacing the things I was hoping to study. So I think it's still very much fluid, and we try to deal with that kind of lack of maybe clarity, and the question of generalization was also a big part of the debates, and especially for colleagues from the global south, who are like, well, your definition is difficult to be applicable for us because the experience would be kind of different. And on the longevity aspect, I think it's a great question. And I think we had also a lot of discussion about, it's not about a moment, or it can be about a moment in time. It's not a kind of enduring identity, right? It's a dynamic. So we have to look at the trajectory, right? And so when we had several of the articles that it's about a trajectory toward moving away from, I don't know, the classic norms of what liberalism is supposed to be in our modern time now. And so trying to take into consideration the time aspect, knowing that you can have back and forth and the term may be fading, right, in a few years. And so I don't think we wanted to impose it as a kind of, it's a permanent concept that will be in every textbook of political science in 20 years, but more to try to capture the kind of zeitgeist, right, the kind of doxa that we see, where it's kind of questioning what we see or not see as the crisis of liberalism. Sam, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that those are two different kinds of questions, and it may be because I live in a political science department that I approach it in that manner. But one kind of question is whether this is a sort of a concept that can be operationalized for social science research. And for reasons I described and others have described, I'm skeptical that's the case. It's a different question why at this moment and under these conditions, this term or this family of terms have seemed so salient. And to answer that question, it doesn't matter whether you have 5 criteria that you can apply to any given case. The answers and value seem to lie elsewhere. And this conversation is making me think that part of the answer to that question is that the term liberalism has been evacuated of almost any meaning. It's become an empty vessel. And yet, rather than dispensing with it and moving on, we seem to be stuck with it. And the phenomena that you're describing are partly, I would venture, a response to that. What the things they're mad about, it's not clear to me, are really liberalism in any social scientific or historical sense. But there seems to be political value in calling them liberalism, and therefore designating them as bad, foreign, corrupting, and so on. We are stuck with liberalism as an anchor concept, but it just doesn't seem to mean very much anymore. Or it means something, but it means so many things to so many people that it can't provide the basis for coherent discussion.
Yeah, I like the idea that liberalism is this kind of anchor concept that has been largely emptied of a lot of things, but you still have, you still have the rebellion against the system as it is, right? Or the rebellions against some form of status quo. The status quo may be interpreted as liberal or not, depending if we applied political philosophy category. We can also say that it's not liberal. So I think it's what illiberalism is doing is this kind of capturing the rebellious or the kind of the crisis moment. And I agree that the kind of multiplicity of prefix around liberalism is an issue, right? It's anti, neo, post-liberalism. So everything seems to be rotating around and so in a sense, it has a normative centrality, even if it's an empty term, is that we cannot move away from it, right? It seems it has been,
orbiting a black hole or something. We are still in place, but there's nothing there.
Was it only written by liberals, or did illiberals write the book?
So That's a good question, because many the globally political science or social science would be mostly liberal author, right? The conservative author are a minority. We had some non-liberal, anti-liberal, illiberal leftist ones. We had, I think, some people who have genuine question. I don't know if they would define themselves as conservative, but who would have genuine kind of, who wouldn't identify themselves as liberal, for sure. And I think that's also something new in the field, is that all the usual research is done like clearly with a liberal implicit or explicit perspective. 1,000. So among the chapter, we were really wanted to have that diversity of perspective. And so all the part which is about the entanglement of what is liberal, what is illiberal, that's where we had the most kind of non-liberal voices, left or conservative, expressing themselves and trying to deal with that. And I think it's an important part of the discussion. And one of the problems is that so far they were outside of the discussion, right? So it was always illiberalism as described by liberals. Can we still make maybe one more question there? Yeah.
In your introductory remarks, you mentioned the coming of a new world order. I would just love to hear a little bit more about what you and the other authors thinking about in terms of new world order. Is it liberal, or if the World Bank, the IMF were to be illiberal, what would that look like? Can you share some?
Yeah, so there is a section that is on the challenges to the so-called liberal international order, with different articles looking at, so of course the challenges, so the global south kind of challenging the unfairness of the global order distribution, people looking at the supposed or real solidarity between so-called illiberal states, so looking at the Russia, China, the usual kind of suspect, but also chapters looking more at, the revival of the civilizational identity and religious identity as being an element of the way we look at the world order. So both kind of looking at how institutionally it's getting transformed or challenged, and how much the more it's the content, right? The idea that it's not only about kind of a dry rights, but it's about identity, civilization, regionalization of globalization. So all the chapters were trying to kind of address that. I'm not sure they come up with like, here is what it will be and so on, but trying to capture the different point of entry where what we call the liberal international order is getting challenged, and trying to move away from the usual, suspect it's all coming from Russia and China, and then looking at things also happening in the West in terms of transformation. Michael, and then still, yeah. Michael here.
Thanks. I'd like to throw a dose of metaphysics into the discussion and ask about religion. I'm a scholar of religion and politics, among other things, and your concept of illiberalism raised a few questions when I thought about my own research interests here. If you look at the 19th century, you could clearly say the Catholic Church was one of the most anti-liberal forces in European politics, which had to do with the very fierce anti-clericalism on the liberal side. So there's a dialectic here that constituted illiberalism on both sides. Or we could say with the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church has made peace with liberalism, at least with democracy and human rights, officially. Although unofficially, there's still a lot going on. And even today, the Pope told American Catholics, there are only two evils to choose from, and you pick the lesser evil in the current previous presidential election. The question is then, calling both Harris and Trump evils, is that still compatible with liberalism, or are we in the realm of illiberalism in this kind of moralistic enunciation? Which brings me to the big question. With your concept of illiberalism, would you say that all monotheistic religions, not just Christianity, but those who require a holy book and whose God demands that there should not be any other gods besides him or her, aren't they all inherently illiberal? And that means maybe polytheistic religions are more liberal than monotheistic religions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, Sam, do you have anything?
I mean,
I like the yeah.
People who've thought that. I mean, I think Voltaire believed something like that. I think Jefferson, in certain moods, probably believed something like that. But on the other hand, if liberalism involves some commitment to human equality and universal moral principles, rights, that seems to be associated, at least historically, with monotheistic theology. So, I would say, and I'm also from time to time a scholar of religion and politics, many religious traditions have liberal and illiberal potentials. And we should avoid sort of essentializing them one way or the other. And the Catholic Church is a great example of that. If you had told liberals of the 19th century or proto-liberals of the 17th century, like John Locke, what the Catholic Church would become in our lifetimes, they would never have believed it. It would have blown their minds and seemed impossible, and yet it did. And that suggests that there are a range of potentials within the Catholic Church, within Christianity, within other religious traditions that can go one way or the other in different circumstances.
Question there in the back.
Having edited this large volume, I would like to know, do you find that most of the impetus for illiberalism is coming from material factors, economic, geopolitical, that sort of thing? Or is it immaterial things like ideology, morality, ethics?
So that's a good question. I would say the literature is usually divided, right, into schools, those for whom it's really the social economic realities that are the core driving illiberalism, and those who consider the material aspect, the kind of culture war, kind of progressivism, transforming our societies. And so for very long, there were these two schools, and now you really have a kind of third school that tried to kind of put the two together and say, well, it's all about form of intersectionality, that you express distress that can be both social, economic, and cultural by kind of looking for a kind of liberal interpretation. So I think now there is a tendency of the literature to try to put them in dialogue and not to keep them kind of dissociated, and trying to force this kind of debates about, but you would still have, I think, you would still have a very strong school who would say it's social economic aspects that are the core, right? If you have a middle classes and that is going very well, you have less political claims for that, or people can accept progressivisms in an easier way. But I would say it was mostly divided among us as like the 40 people would have like the two schools, but everybody is now kind of trying to be in dialogue with each other. Yeah, Christine. Then.
A question from the online audience. They ask, do you think that Western judgment of political systems elsewhere as illiberal may be in part ethnocentric, given that a nation chooses its politics in compliance with its political culture, core values, and history?
Yeah, I think so both in Central Eastern Europe and in the Global South, I think there is a very strong sense, right, that's Western domination or Western centrism in defining what is good politically, what is bad, how society should be developed. I think it has backlashed very largely, and now we have also a great body of research on Central Eastern Europe looking at the so-called transition as being lived as a colonial experience by Western Europe, and therefore creating backlash. And I think from the literature on the Global South, I think also this idea that Okay, the problem with liberalism is that it's arrived as a Western creation and it was accompanied with a lot of kind of domination and colonialism and a kind of patronizing aspect that is still present in our own foreign policy. Plus, I think the kind of liberal interventionisms are really contributed to delegitimize a lot of liberalism in terms of its geopolitical aspects. So I think it's maybe not very visible when we are at the center, right, in US and Western Europe, but for all the population that are seeing themselves as periphery of the Western order, I think that's kind of dominating liberalism as being a big element of the backlash.
So I mean to beat this point to death, but you're talking about the Catholic Church. I don't think you could question their record at the Crusades and on their way to the Crusades, the Jews that they killed. But the thing that a lot of people don't realize, and we got the Museum of the Bible here in Washington, D.C., which is well worth the visit, on the 4th floor, the evolution of one of the 40,000 different Bibles. But the guy who thought it was a great idea to put the Word of God into English, and he got asked for permission, and it was denied. He did it anyway. Then he went to Switzerland, hid out until he thought it was safe. When he came back to England, he was beheaded. True story.
How does the handbook deal with the pre-liberal structures that liberalism has in many instances been based upon, and in many instances has also, one could arguably say, cannibalized, and then which many of those who now call themselves illiberals are now reacting against the cannibalism of pre-liberal structures, possibly by liberalism. How does the book, or how does the handbook deal with that topic?
So we don't really, because we have a very time-limited definition of illiberalism, really not going back more than 50 years ago. So we really try to use the term uniquely in a kind of contemporary settings, but there have been another handbook by another group of colleagues done a year before, published by Routledge, where they had a more historical perspective, which I think was interesting, but was also creating even more challenges in terms of conceptual clarity, where they were trying to look at kind of historical experience. And there have been a lot of discussion about, you know, this kind of historical families. How do we think about illiberalism today if we want to compare to the 20s or 30s, for example, right? How do we, where liberalism was also getting kind of challenged. So there are people who are interested in kind of looking contemporary experience in a kind of comparative historical perspective. We didn't do that in the volume because we wanted to stay centered on kind of contemporary experience. And as I said, the two kind of boundaries was like more or less, you know, cultural revolution in the 60s and neoliberalism in the 80s as being the two core elements that both created social economic grievances against some form of neoliberalism and kind of culture war aspect as being the core. So we didn't really address that. There is no more question. And thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, your book and your talk has inspired me. I'm writing a response. It's going to be called Traditional Neologism. And the definition of illiberalism will be, you know it when you see it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Sam, for being the discussant, and hope to see you again in the other talks of the Elliott School.